Trump's got a lot of skills here. Trump's got a lot of street skills. He's gotten like where he is in terms of being a bully boy in many respects. But what happens here is when people figure out that the bully boy just wants to be liked, then they play on that.
Hi, I'm Maddie Hale and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've had a long chat with Scott Lucas. He's of course a professor of American Studies at the Clinton Institute at the University of Dublin. We've spoken to him about this meeting taking place today in Istanbul. We've got the United States, we've got Ukraine, Russia and of course Turkey mediating it. So what could come out of that? We've also spoken to him about this failed meeting between Vladimir Putin, Zelensky and Donald Trump, why Trump didn't attend, why Putin didn't attend. We've also spoken to him in extensive detail about Donald Trump's trip to the Middle East. What did he get out of it? And why is his personal family business involved? So much to talk about today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube. Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at the Clinton Institute at the University of Dublin. Thank you so much for joining the Trump Report.
Oh, it's always great to be here, Maddie.
Good to have you back on. We've had a hiatus, you and I, for a few weeks while I was back in Oz, so it's good to have you back on the show where we dive into all the big stories coming out of the Trump administration, from international affairs to, of course, domestic policies. But there's so much happening on the international scale this week, so we can't even dive so much so into what's happening in the US. But I want to start off, as you and I record this interview right now, a meeting is taking place between delegates of Russia, Ukraine, and of course Turkey is mediating it. All we know currently is that the US, that Russia said the US isn't present, but they think a meeting between them and the US is certainly necessary. We know that they're talking about a prisoner swap. They're talking about how to get back captured Ukrainian children. But is there anything you think that we will get out of this meeting in terms of brokering a peace deal?
No. But let me give you the latest updates, first of all, as we are here on Friday. So the Americans are there now. Donald Trump is not there because Donald Trump was only going to go to Istanbul if there was going to be a deal, and he gets a big photo. But the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is in some of the talks. There's also the American envoy to Ukraine, Keith Kellogg, which is quite important because he's an actual envoy who has some sense of what's going on, as opposed to the pretend envoy, Steve Witkoff.
But Scott, just to interrupt, Marco Rubio said yesterday that he didn't think that he should meet the culture minister for Russia because he was too low rank for him.
Right, but there were two sets of talks this morning, Maddie. So the first sets of talks, which is significant, is Ukraine gets together with the Turks and with the U.S., including Rubio, including Keith Kellogg, and they're discussing what Turkey got from the Russian delegation on Thursday night, right? So they're prepping all their lines in terms of what's going to happen next, because the second meeting, and this is where it gets interesting, is going to be Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey, right? Because the Turks are the brokers. Now, there was a moment late on Friday morning when the story came out, which was Russia wasn't going to go on with those talks if the Turks were there. They wanted to get the Ukrainians one-on-one, right? And Ukraine quite reasonably said, no, we're not doing it this way. We're not going to have any mano-a-mano bully boy tactics and so on. The Turks are there as the brokers, and it appears the Russians back down. And that second meeting, Russia, Ukraine, and Turkey, is going on as you and I speak, early Friday afternoon. Now, we have got no lines in terms of what has come out, but let me give you the parameters of what we're talking about. First of all, it's important to know that Ukraine is there to get a ceasefire. That's their first goal, 30-day ceasefire. That is backed by the Europeans with whom they've been working. It is supported by the Trump administration. It's supported by the Turks. Indeed, these talks would not have occurred if Ukraine had not pursued that ceasefire, because let's be very clear what happened. They backed Vladimir Putin into a corner. Let's have a ceasefire. Let's stop. And Putin said, oh, no, let's have direct talks. Let's have no ceasefire, let's have direct talks, right? Then Ukraine called Putin's bluff. They said, you want the talks? Then Vladimir Zelensky's going to go to Istanbul. He's going to meet you one-on-one. Here you go. Here's your direct talks. And Putin's like, no, sorry. Busy, lots of things to do. North Koreans are coming in to visit, And the Kremlin's line is, well, we have to have preparatory talks before Putin can meet Zelensky, which is why the Russians send a lower level delegation. The real snub here, and I'm sorry, I'm not getting to the answer about what's coming out. I need to set it up this way, is the Russians not only did not send Putin, they didn't send the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Now, Ukraine's got its defense minister there, its foreign minister there. The U.S. has Marco Rubio. The Turks have their foreign minister. And Russia's like, no, we're not going to send foreign. We're going to send a guy named Vladimir Medinsky, who I suspect a lot of people don't know about, because Medinsky is a former minister of culture, and he's basically a loyal servant to Putin. And the key here is that Medinsky led the Russian delegation when the Russians tried to get Ukraine to knuckle under in March, April of 2022, while we were in the first weeks of the invasion. So what the Kremlin was going to do is they're going to send Medinsky out there, and their PR line, Maddie's going to be this, which is, there's a continuity here. We want the Istanbul talks of 2022 to be replicated, because what the Russians want is not a ceasefire. They're going to put their maximum demands, just as they did in 2022. We want Ukrainian territory. We want a neutral Ukraine, in other words, a weakened Ukraine. We want a demilitarized Ukraine, in other words, limited armed forces. And we want no Ukrainian links, security guarantees for the West, with the West. Okay, Ukraine's not going to accept that. They're not going to accept any of that. All right, so if Russia's not going to accept the ceasefire, and Ukraine's not going to accept a Russian ultimatum, the most you probably get out of this is what you started off with, Maddie, which is what we call confidence building measures. And that is, we might get an agreement to swap some prisoners of war, including and some civilians who've been detained by Russia. Now, we've had those going on through the conflict anyway, but we might get another one of those. We might get an agreement to bring some of those Ukrainian children back from Russia, where they were deported, in some cases 3 years ago. But these are very, very limited measures. They don't get at the heart of this, which is Russia is not going to stop its invasion and its air attacks. Indeed, early this morning, Friday morning, the Russians sent in more than 100 drones, killed 3 people, injured about, I think, 15 to 20 over the past 24 hours. And that's what they'll keep doing. They'll just keep lobbing stuff across. So what's the purpose of this? What's the purpose of all of this? The purpose of this is Ukraine knows they're not going to get anything out of Putin and the Kremlin. Europe knows they're not going to get it. But Ukraine and Europe hold the diplomatic high ground. We're the ones who are ready to stop the fighting. We're the ones to ready stop the killing. And why do you want to have that diplomatic high ground? You want it, first of all, from the Americans, because you want to bring the Americans in on security guarantees for Ukraine. And you want it more broadly for the international community, right? Because, there are Asian countries involved in this. Australia's involved in this. There are countries in the Middle East and in Latin America that are watching this. China's watching. So what you do is you call the Kremlin's bluff. You expose the fact that they're not really interested in a ceasefire and they're not interested in a compromise, and then you support Ukraine. You keep supporting them so that their defense doesn't break.
Yeah. And it seems right now, Scott, that Putin and the Kremlin are buying time. They're putting up distractions. They've been doing this dance for a number of months, especially since Trump was brought in and these discussions begun. They're buying time. They're repeating history, as you said. They're replicating the meeting from 2022. Nothing has changed, basically. They're asking for the same concessions from Ukraine that they asked way back when. The only difference is now we're back at the table and we're discussing perhaps we'll capture Ukrainian children, a prisoner swap, and the United States are more heavily involved than they were before, and they've been acting as if as a mediator, but it hasn't been as successful as Donald Trump had wanted. Now, Donald Trump said he didn't go to this meeting in Istanbul yesterday. He basically said, well, Putin wasn't going, but why would Putin go to this meeting if I wasn't going? What would he get out of that meeting if I wasn't there? Now, it's an interesting thing to say. If you believe that, if you are committed to ending this war and you believe that the only way you'd get him physically, Vladimir Putin physically to the negotiating table is with you there, then why wouldn't you make the effort when you're already in the continent to go to this meeting in Istanbul, to carve out a few hours of your time? You've got the plane. We know you've got Air Force One there. Why would you not make that time, go to the meeting, and if not, force Putin's hand? Say, if you don't go to this meeting with me, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to enforce these sanctions that I said I would, these secondary sanctions. I'm going to place tariffs on any country that imports oil from you and therefore, completely disrupt your economy. I will do everything in my power to upend your economy, your life, your leadership, unless you come to this meeting with me.
Because Donald Trump's not interested in being in Istanbul while negotiations are underway. He's not interested in doing the hard task of negotiations. He's interested in the victory lap. In other words, what Trump wanted was the idea that the Russians and Ukraine were going to strike some sort of agreement, then he would sweep in and he'd get the photo op. That's what he always does, right? Now, and remember the context here, Manny, is that I think he's in the UAE today. So I think, he's been in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, and he's getting all the flattery, all the celebrations. The Saudis, the UAE, the Qataris, they're all playing him like a fiddle. But of course, he's getting the ego boost from that. Why should he give that up and go to Ukraine, where you would actually have to sit down and talk about details of a settlement? Why would he do that? The strange thing that's going on is that one of the reasons why Trump's getting played in the Gulf is because all his people are sitting there in Turkey, right, or elsewhere. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, he's in Turkey, right? Keith Kellogg, for what it's worth, he's a Ukraine rep, so he's clearly going to be in Turkey. Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, I don't know where Pete Hegseth is.
He was in Qatar, wasn't he?
Oh, God, yeah, that's right. He was rousing the troops. That's right. All right, let's talk about how effective U.S. diplomacy is when you got Pistol Pete as your main guy, right? So Scott Bessent, Treasury Secretary, he's dealing with the Chinese right now. So you got Trump there along with Pistol Pete, who I'm sure is being well-behaved, completely sober, and, as we know he is, right? And I'm sure that's a great team to have in the Gulf. The adults in the room, if there are any adults in the room, are sitting there in Turkey, right? But they're facing the fact that there's nowhere to go with these talks. There's no settlement which is going to be possible. You're doing this for diplomatic positioning for what comes next. And that's why I think it's going to be interesting, which is you have to watch people like Rubio and Kellogg, because Trump's just simply a grandstander. And grandstanders, I don't know if there's an Australian word for it, or I'm trying to think of what we would say in Britain. I'm sure there's a few.
Maybe like a showman or something.
Oh, God, yeah, he's much more than a showman. I mean, he's basically a snake oil salesman, right? And the snake oil salesman wants to go in there when he knows you're going to buy the product. And he didn't know that Putin was going to buy the product. And in fact, Putin wasn't going to buy this product. So Trump bails on this. Just as, by the way, although we might not talk about it today, he's bailed on Israel-Gaza.
Sorry, Scott, we will talk about that, but I just want to get your thoughts. Do you on this, and this is a yes or no question, do you think that Donald Trump, do you think that he's approached this Russia-Ukraine situation and realized it's a harder negotiation, harder deal to make than he thought it was going to be?
Donald Trump doesn't think about whether or not it's a hard deal. That's all I got to say. What Donald Trump does is he goes in and he says, art of the deal. We're going to get a deal. And he will try to make statements which is to bully folks into accepting what he wants. He will threaten folks in terms of accepting what he wants. But he doesn't do the detailed work for a deal. And he doesn't really have the talented personnel there to do the detailed work for a deal. So do I think he realizes that? I think Donald Trump is simply someone, if I say it, it will come true. I honestly think that's what it is. And in this case, he doesn't have someone who's going to play him or manipulate with him. It's not in Putin's interest to give Trump a deal at this point. And it's certainly not in Zelensky's interest to capitulate to the Russians. So no, I think Trump will just simply continue to spout off. But I think you're going to see Trump less and less involved with Ukraine, Russia, although you'll see other people in the administration who will be involved.
That doesn't surprise me, Scott, because he'll start to get busier with his own administration, his own work that needs to be done on the domestic level. That's not a criticism because he's the president of the United States. He has other things to do. I completely understand that. But this was meant to be a top priority in the campaign election. But I want to read something out from Sky News today, which I thought was interesting. This is an article from Adam Parsons. He said that Mr. Putin seems to have secured himself future negotiations that expressly exclude Mr. Zelensky, but do include an American president who seems happy to hand over Ukrainian territory to Moscow in order to end a war being conducted thousands of miles from his own country. It is the Trump era, and Mr. Putin, more than most, doesn't just know that fact, but seems to know how to exploit it. So I want your reaction to that, because as you mentioned, the adult in the room. The adult in the room currently is President Zelensky, but he's about to be excluded from the room yet again. This is the first time he was allowed in the room today, and it obviously went to shambles yesterday. And then today, well, we don't know how that negotiation has gone.
Yeah, let's take this in two stages. First of all, no, Zelensky's not going to show up there because, there's no one at his level to be there, but he's got talented people there. I mean, he's got his defense minister there, Rustem Umerov. He's got Andrei Sybiha, who's the foreign minister. He's got his presidential chief of staff, longtime chief of staff, Andrei Yermak there. So you've got some serious folks there at that table. So I'm not as concerned about that. What I'm concerned that Adam Parsons thing is referring to is the ultimate Kremlin play is to give Trump the one-on-one with Putin, right? Now, there is a risk of that. Marco Rubio yesterday said two things. One is he called out the Russians and he said, look, they sent a lower level delegation. We're not going to get anything out of this meeting, or I don't think we'll get anything out of this meeting because they sent a lower level delegation. But then he said, the only way I think we're going to get things done is if Trump meets Putin face to face. Now, those two things don't fit together if you think about it, right? Because Trump going to meet Putin face to face without effectively a deal that has been arranged leaves him open to being exploited and manipulated, right? Right now, the Kremlin are weighing up when they might offer Trump that visit. But I think there are breaks now on Trump with this. And this is why I think, look at the diplomatic game in this longer run. Because Russia has held out against a ceasefire for so long now, and because they've kept on imposing the maximum demands, they've unsettled a lot of people in Washington who will not be happy with the Trump visit to Putin. And I'm talking about Republicans, not Democrats. Think about who else is in Turkey this week. Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham, longtime Trump loyalist, but a very influential senator up on the Hill. And he's there basically saying, you've got to stand by Ukraine, right? Now, that sentiment amongst Republicans, I mean, I know they've rolled over and laid doggo for Trump on a whole series of issues we could talk about. But on Ukraine, they're starting to dig their heels in a bit. So I think the Kremlin may have a window, which is, do they go big, invite Trump to Moscow, and hope that they can withstand the criticism they're going to get from everybody on this? I don't see it happening right now.
It's a one-to-watch situation. It's kind of up in the air right now, Scott. There's so many questions about what will happen within the day, but over the next few days. And I kind of just hope that the United States at least stays in in the game, in the negotiation. They don't back out because, of course, that is the worry. But I want to move on now because you mentioned Trump's Middle East trip. For anyone watching or listening, Donald Trump has been in the Middle East for the last 4 days. He's been in Saudi, he's been in Qatar, he's been in the UAE, he's been busy making deals. He went over there with the goal of bringing back around $1 trillion worth of investments into the United States. He's got a lot of making up to do post tariffs. He's got a lot of making up to do when it comes to the economy. This is his shtick. He needs to bring money into the US. Now, so far, we've seen him inking a few deals. He's got a $200 billion partnership with the UAE to build a data center in Abu Dhabi. Among other plans, I will say, he's got a $600 billion investment from Saudi and an agreement from Qatar to buy 210 Boeing planes and invest $10 billion into a US military facility and buy $42 billion worth of US weapons. Has this trip been successful, Scott? And what does it look like to you as an American, and even though you're based in Dublin? Is money the goal? But is this a correct way of doing it?
Oh, money's the goal, Maddie. But Donald Trump's other motive is he's going to make a lot of money out of this deal on a personal level. And we can talk about that in a minute. But if you were going to talk about this transactional idea that, investing in America, let's break that down first of all. Look, the Saudis have been there before. Back in 2017, they said we're going to $200 billion we're going to put into U.S. trade and investment. And this was the opening stage of how they would play with Trump. UAE and Qatar also made commitments in the first term. Now they come back in 2025 and they go big here and they put the big numbers up, right? But let's talk about where that's coming in. First of all, what they want to get out of Trump is they want to get out of Trump American military equipment. They want to bolster their militaries, right? So yeah, you buy planes from American military planes. You also buy Boeings, for your fleets, which is fine. Investing in a U.S. military air base, well, that means you basically invested in a U.S. military commitment, which entrenches you in that region. Because remember, the U.S. almost left Qatar during Trump's first administration. If the U.S. is putting more money into their military bases in the area, they're less likely to go. If you talk about those data center up in UAE and so on, if you talk about getting basically high-tech and AI investment from the U.S., including access to U.S. chips, which is what Gulf states want, then they benefit from that deal in a big way, right? In other words, what I'm saying to you is, yes, there is money which is changing hands here, and there are some American companies that will make money out of this. But the Gulf states are doing this to boost their own security needs and to boost their own domestic economies while flattering Trump. That's why I said earlier on that they're playing him. Now, it will provide headlines for Trump, which gives him the good news headlines on the surface, which is, I'm going to bring all this money into the states. That's not quite what's happening here. If you look at what's happening, a lot of the money is actually going into the Gulf states to build up their economies.
So it's not a fair deal, Scott. It's not 50-50.
What I'm saying here is it's a deal which is going to benefit some American companies, but will it benefit the American economy overall? If you're talking about the broad context of tariffs, if you're talking about the economic shocks which are happening on other fronts, no, it's a glossy headline, especially because that Saudi $600 billion that they say they're putting into the United States, some of that's was already agreed with the Biden administration. So, that's the spin.
Scott, let me read out this from the New York Times, because I think this is a really interesting point that they made out for anyone who's kind of trying to figure out what this $200 billion investment is into this data center in Abu Dhabi. So the New York Times article reads, the AI deals have caused people inside and outside the White House to wrestle with an unexpected question. Is the Trump administration, in its zeal to make deals in a region where Mr. Trump and his family have financial ties, outsourcing the industry of the future to the Middle East? And we'll get into the family dynamics of what they've got in the Trump organization. It reads, the tensions capture some of the contradictions of Mr. Trump's policies. The president has long criticized how US industries were moved offshore, and in recent months he has tried to bring them back by introducing steep tariffs. But in his first major diplomatic trip, he has shown a globalist interest in allowing American AI companies to thrive by going offshore. So in the matter of a month, when do we implement these tariffs? April 3rd. in a matter of 6 weeks. Is that 6 weeks? This has contradicted exactly what he wanted. He wanted industries back in America.
Yeah, but how much money has the European Union invested in the Trump family? How much money has the UK invested in the Trump family? Now, how much money are the Gulf states investing in the Trump family? And there's the answer to your question. Oh, and a lot. Oh, and by the way, Elon Musk also happened to be on this trip. And you might want to talk about what Elon Musk's interests are as well in terms of what's going on. So, yeah, so let's talk specifics here. I mean, that's absolutely the point that we're trying to make here is that when Trump talks about investing in the United States, that's not exactly what's happening here. American companies may be investing in the Gulf states, which is fair enough, and you could talk about it, but let's be honest about what's going on. I mean, and let's go ahead and talk about the Trump elephant.
Yeah, let's get into the Trump organization, which of course the vice president is Eric Trump. They have a massive wealth management of assets that they manage. There's a lot of money involved, a lot of real estate, a lot of golf courses. Everyone knows that this is a family that have they're real estate moguls. And this didn't just stop when the president became the president. This is an ongoing family business.
Yeah. In other words, Trump actually ripped up the whole notion of avoiding conflicts of interest and has done that consistently. Some of this happened to an extent in the first term, but I'll leave that for a second. Let's just talk about where we are in 2025. Eric Trump and Donald Trump Jr. have been in the UAE, specifically I think Dubai, and they are proposing an 80-story Trump Tower with apparently the world's highest infinity horizon pool for folks who are in that kind of thing. I hear it's quite nice, which is overlooking the Burj Al Khalifa, the world's tallest skyscraper, right? 80 stories. They are in Qatar trying to negotiate a golf course and resort deal to the tune of $5.5 billion. That's with a B, dollars. Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, in 2022 started up an investment firm with $2 billion of backing from Saudi Arabia. As of 2024, that firm, called Affinity, had not returned any profits. However, its assets went up 60% because it obtained a further $1.5 million from Qatar and UAE. So this is an area where, just as American companies can make a bit of money, but while raising questions about offshoring with things like AI and high tech, the Trump family can also make a lot of money trading off of this.
But Scott, sorry to interrupt, because I do want to not play a devil's advocate, but I do want to put the statement in just so people know that the Trump organization has responded to, I don't want to call them allegations, but queries about the motives behind this. The Trump organization spokesperson said that there was no affiliation, partnership, or engagement with Qatar's government, and added that the company's agreement to brand that project is with Dar Global. The Trump organization does not conduct business with the government, with any government entity. So they've denied that this is corrupt. They've denied that this has anything to do with any of the work President Trump is doing.
That's not how this works, though. And you and I can cut. You know how you would cut through this immediately.
I just have to put the statements in. I have to put the statements in.
What happens is that Qatar and Saudi Arabia, UAE, have got state-backed companies with whom the Trump folks are dealing. So you say they're dealing with the companies, but they're not dealing with the government. When, for example, the Trump people were trying to get a Trump Tower built in Moscow in 2015, 2016, they were going to individuals who were not part of the Russian government. They were going with individuals who might be supported by the Kremlin, right? So, I won't even add the other proviso, by the way, that when you talk about the Trump organization, in any statement they make, remember this is a company that paid one of the U.S.'s highest fines for fraud in New York State because of their past record. But to bring it back to the specifics at hand, no. You have got a family company which is intertwined with the U.S. government doing business with Gulf interest who have links to their governments. At least be honest about it. I mean, you could say this is the way the world works now, but hold your hand up and
They can't do that because the Trump administration and Republicans have just spent the better half of the last 3 or 4 years calling out Hunter Biden for his work and using VP Daddy Joe Biden's name when he was working in Ukraine for the energy company Burisma Holdings. And, we can debate that. I personally have covered that a lot. And I do think that Hunter was quite corrupt in that. So I wonder, the Trumps can't come out and say that we're doing a similar thing. So you can understand the statement I read, but it is interesting. We've got a lot of work happening in the Middle East, professionally and personally.
Yeah, professionally, and I guess we should get to the wider. Why does this matter? Why does it matter? Let me give you an example of how this matters, and then take it really up to a wide point. The interesting case that kind of has come and gone in all this week is something that I think is a positive, and that is that the U.S., at least in principle, because Donald Trump announced it, is lifting sanctions on Syria after the fall of the Assad regime, which had been sanctioned because of its mass killings and its war crimes since 2011. The new government has been in power 5 months now, and they're looking for economic recovery. Well, the U.S. sanctions were hindering that. Trump all of a sudden announced this out of the blue when he was in Saudi Arabia. Now let's talk about how that happened. The Saudis talked to Trump and said, we want this to happen. Now, the Syrians had been working for weeks in Washington. They've been lobbying for this, and I could tell you about that story. But U.S. agencies were still considering whether or not they were going to lift the sanctions or even ease them. Now, all of a sudden, Trump, without consulting his agencies, because the Saudis and to a lesser extent the Turks have said, we want this to happen, he announces it just like that. That's the type of thing that happens very quickly. Now, in this case, I'm actually pleased it's happened because I think Syria, although it's a complex situation, I'm cautiously hopeful that country can recover. But let's put this in a wider sense. Who's calling the shots now in the Middle East? Who's calling the shots? Is it the U.S. government or is it the Gulf states? And I'd say to you, it's the latter now, because they know that if they flatter Trump and give him a bit of a payoff, then they're the ones that can get their interest. And think about how much that changes what we've thought about the Middle East going back maybe 75 years. That there's a new dynamic which links up the states in that region with a very different way of conducting U.S. foreign policy because it's a personal foreign policy under Donald Trump.
But the other thing is, Scott, is Trump buttering up Arab leaders because he has so much incentive to keep oil prices down.
He'll say that, but I don't think that's really been at the forefront of what's happening right now.
You don't think that's the bigger picture? You think that's part of it?
No. I don't think that's the bigger picture. Let me give you another example, actually, because I want to put this out there, because it's on Gaza, which is really interesting. In the past 48 hours, Trump has said completely different things on Gaza. Actually, it was just yesterday. Yesterday, he said, we're going to bring freedom to Gaza, right? And this is the whole idea of the, Riviera in the Middle East, right? And we're going to bring freedom to Gaza. We're going to stop it. And it was just like a wishful. He comes out with a very different statement today, which is, we've got to do something about the people who are starving in Gaza. So he's no longer talking about displacing them. He's talking about the fact you need to get aid to them. Now, who's blocking that aid? The Israelis have been blocking it since the start of March, right? Now, why did Trump change within a few hours from freedom for Gaza to get humanitarian aid into Gaza? Well, you know who wants to get humanitarian aid into Gaza for their own motives and interest? The Saudis, the Turks, the UAE,
well, let me read.
and the Qataris.
Let me read this out, Scott, because I would love to be a fly on the wall in Netanyahu's office right now, because this does feel like the ultimate betrayal from what is meant to be the closest of allies, Israel and the United States. Now, while speaking to the media, Donald Trump said this about Qatar: "We're going to protect this country. It is a very special place with a special royal family. It's great people, and they're going to be protected by the United States." This is a country, now this is not me spitting bad blood about Qatar, but this is a country that has financed Hamas over $1 billion worth to finance their terrorist organization. It is also the country where they house Hamas leaders. So the fact that he said that they're going to protect Qatar, who were somewhat responsible for what happened on October 7, who are responsible for allowing Hamas to continue to operate a war and to starve their own people in Gaza and to kill Israelis and whatever the whole story is. We don't want to get into that. This must be the ultimate betrayal to Israel right now.
There's been a series of incidents which have taken place. If you go back to when Benjamin Netanyahu went to the White House several weeks ago. Now, we were in this point where Israel was going to resume the open-ended war in Gaza. And in a sense, Israel has benefited from the fact that the Trump administration has almost given it a blank check, despite the statement that Trump just made today, in terms of conducting that war. But Trump, with Netanyahu beside him, announced that he was going to go into negotiations with Iran over Iran's nuclear program. Now that totally unsettled Netanyahu, because he had gone to Washington in part to make sure that Trump didn't do that, right? Now, why is Trump pursuing the idea of a nuclear settlement with Iran, having walked out of the nuclear agreement in 2018? Because he thinks it's a photo opportunity where he can get it, and yada, 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 right? But then you do the follow-up here, which is that Trump does not go to Israel on this trip. He goes to the Gulf states. Now, why doesn't he go to Israel on this trip? Well, Israel doesn't have the bright, shiny things. Israel doesn't have the $1 trillion, idea of investment that's going to be put in there. In other words, the financial heft and the monetary heft, both at a personal level and in terms of a state-to-state level, or at least say corporate level, is coming out of the Gulf states. And so, yeah, the Israelis have benefited in terms of the Gaza battle in that they're under no pressure to ceasefire from the Americans. And they won't be. But in a wider sense, in this new Middle East that we're talking about, they're looking at the fact that Gulf states are going to be emboldened by what's taking place. And although it's a completely fluid situation, that Iran may be able to get itself out of a straitjacket, an economic straitjacket, by getting some type of deal with the Americans.
Scott, yes or no? Has Donald Trump turned his back on Israel and jumped in bed with the Middle East?
Donald Trump has not completely turned his back on Israel, because there's certain things that Donald Trump will be invested in. And that is because, of course, many Americans are invested in Israel, and the Republican Party is invested in Israel, right? But in terms of Donald Trump's going to the highest bidder. Let's put it that way. Now, what can Israel do to outbid the Gulf states?
That's the question on everyone's lips as we kind of watch, because no one's really saying what slap in the face this is to Israel and to Netanyahu. And no one's saying that Israel is perfect. Netanyahu's wanted for war crimes, but we're saying that this was not the path we thought that Trump would go down. But we don't have long, so I want to get your thoughts on this. We saw the complimentary language this week between Trump and his Arab friends. He said, "I like you so much." He said, I think he said that to the Crown Prince. He said, "You're attractive to the Syrian president. You're tough." He said to the president of the UAE that you're a magnificent man. Now, this is the language we're seeing. This is the new friendships we see brewing as he's gone to the Middle East for the last 4 days. But how much of a contrast do you see the language, the relationship that took place in the last few days, and the relationship between long-standing allies such as Europe, the UK, Australia, Canada, Denmark.
There are no alliances with this Trump administration. For the first time since the end of World War II, the United States government is not one that works with alliances, at least in terms of its president and its inner circle. Now, there are still structures for alliances. NATO is still there, for example. You could talk about other regional organizations in which the U.S. is involved. You could talk about the Quad, for example, in the Asia-Pacific area. But in terms of those alliances that we think about that link the U.S. with Europe and Asia and so on, that's not the way this works, because Donald Trump doesn't do multilateral. Donald Trump does bilateral. And he does bilateral not on the basis of a geopolitical assessment or a strategic assessment. He does it on the basis of a personal assessment. And for a long time, we talked about it, for example, with Vladimir Putin. Trump genuinely admires Putin. Trump genuinely wants Putin to be his friend. Now, Russia's misplayed its hand with Trump a bit, which we've already talked about. Donald Trump admires Xi. Donald Trump wants to be president for life like Xi Jinping in China. But right now, he's fronting up to China in a tariff war to see if he can outdo Trump. In other cases, what happens is Donald Trump looks at leaders who flatter him, and he says, they're tough. They're tough. Actually, mate, they're not so tough as the fact that they figured out your weakness. And Trump's got a lot of skills here. Trump's got a lot of street skills. He's gotten like where he is in terms of being a bully boy in many respects. But what happens here is when people figure out that the bully boy just wants to be liked, then they play on that. And that's where we are, because there's a couple of other rules that I'll put out for you. The European Union can't do this game because it is 27 countries who all have to agree on a foreign policy. Individual leaders can kind of play Trump like Emmanuel Macron has, but the EU can't do it as a bloc. Trump doesn't do multilateral. And here's just another stinger just to remind you, all those names of people who Trump's admired, who talks about who's tough, how many of them are women? With the exception possibly of Georgia Maloney.
I was about to say, with the exception of Maloney.
Yeah, Trump basically doesn't do praise for women leaders. He doesn't. Yeah, that leads to bigger issues, but I'd have to go back into Don's childhood all the way up until his 79th year to detail that for you.
Maybe the solving the problem would be to finally elect more women into leadership roles, Scott. But we don't have time to discuss what an insane idea that would be. God forbid we'd have females running a country.
Oh my God.
Scott Lucas, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
All right, women rule. We'll talk to you next time, Maddie.